InFi, episode 15.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance, hosted by American economist and author Dr. Robert Murphy. Each week, tune in for dynamic discussions with business pioneers about emerging trends in finance, life insurance, asset management, technology, and more. Now, let's talk the future of finance.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the InFi podcast. This episode is going to be fairly unique in that I'm going to be speaking with ChatGPT. So the genesis of this particular episode is that I had been writing things on the economic potential of GPT, specifically GPT-4, like seeing the innovations that they had made with that particular version. And to showcase it, I released an article summarizing two separate, let's call them conversations that I had with GPT-4 on pretty technical issues, just to show people, in case you haven't been keeping tabs, like, hey, look at the state of the art now with these large language models, or LLMs. All right. And so then I thought, why don't I give a version of that here on the InFi podcast as well? And at first I thought I would just sit here and read to you the transcript. And I thought, well, that's kind of boring. That's not fun. And then, of course, the obvious, I know, let's make it look like I'm actually interacting with GPT-4 on these matters. So, of course, what you're going to see here in a minute, we put in some bells and whistles on our end, but I promise you what we did not do is go in and doctor the text. Okay, so what you're about to see is us sort of reenacting, enhancing the conversation I had, that, the original conversation was just me typing and it answering in text within the GPT environment. And so we're, of course, we're taking that raw material and then we're here now making it look as if we had an actual conversation. But again, the point being, it's not that we went in and changed the words of this, that what you're about to see, the actual back and forth of what I said and then what GPT-4 said in response, was what happened in terms of the typing. Now, at some point, we may skip through, and that just because the actual conversation may have taken longer than we decided, would be good for the pacing of this particular episode in terms of, the trade-off between showing you guys what it's capable of and then not boring you with unnecessary details. So that's what you may see if we decide to edit it just for constraints of timing. But again, we are not at all putting words into GPT-4's mouth. Everything you're going to see in this is something that it actually said in response. And again, big picture, the main reason for us doing this is just to make sure you realize how advanced these large language models have become already. And that's part of the point I was making in my article, which, we'll link to, of course, here, folks. You can go see it. It's at the Infineo archives for our articles. But the point I was making is, you can see how capable these things are, so that businesses, particularly those that rely on telecommuting workers, or people who don't work in the office, but they just use the internet to communicate with other team members, those types of businesses really need to sit down and figure out, how do we integrate GPT-4 into our operations? Because I think there's plenty of ways that it can help augment the productivity of your existing employees. But that's not the case I'm making right now. For now, let me just showcase the capabilities, the simulated intelligence of GPT-4 by having two different conversations with it. So for this first conversation, the backstory is I had been grappling with the MMT, the modern monetary theory camp, for years at this point. And Stephanie Kelton, one of their leaders, put out this tweet that, in my opinion, had a subtle but serious problem with it. That she thought she was making this real profound point, but when you thought it through, you realized, no, she's actually not. I put it up on Twitter, and then I noticed, though, that except for one guy, nobody really got the point I was making. And so I said, you know what? Let me just refine my own thinking. Let me go talk to ChatGPT and see if it can help me parse this tweet. So to be clear, here in the beginning of this conversation, I'm sort of playing dumb. Like I say to ChatGPT, like, help me understand this. I knew exactly what she was trying to say, but I was trying to get it warmed up because I didn't want to overwhelm it right away. Okay. So that's why, I take the posture that I do in this. But again, the point being, I wanted to just talk with someone that had a deep understanding of MMT and so forth, and was a very crisp thinker, and that I could just have an extended discussion with an analysis to really drill down to make sure what my intuitive reaction was to her tweet was correct. And so we'll see how that plays out. And last thing I'll mention is the first thing I did in this conversation, I just took a screenshot of her tweet and uploaded that as an image, a PNG file, and just said what I said, and then it interpreted that. And then we'll see in the next conversation, I took it a step further and I just uploaded an image, a screenshot of a political cartoon, right? So that it wasn't just text. It was, there was an image there that the computer had to interpret, and then we had a conversation about that. So again, I'm just showing you, it's not merely the GPT-4 at this point, can interpret text. You can send it images too, and it can analyze that stuff and have conversations about it. So again, okay. So here we go. This is the image I uploaded. For those of you who are listening to just the audio, by the way, I would encourage you on this particular episode, if you're someone who normally consumes your podcast just via audio, for this one, because we're, showing what does GPT-4 look like when it's speaking to us, I would encourage you to watch the video. But in case you haven't, let me go ahead and read this. So this is the tweet from Stephanie Kelton. Them, : so this is her talking and she's doing a dialogue. Them, : we have to deal with America's debt problem. Me. So you want to prevent holders of US dollars from shifting those dollars from checking to savings accounts at the Fed? Them. I don't know what that means. Me. That's the problem. Okay, now this is me. So I posted that PNG, and now this is me talking about that to GPT. This is a tweet from Stephanie Kelton, a famous proponent of modern monetary theory. Can you explain what her argument is?
Stephanie Kelton is known for her advocacy of modern monetary theory, MMT, a school of economic thought that views the financial capabilities of a sovereign currency issuer, such as the United States, differently from that of households or businesses. In this tweet, Kelton is engaging with a common concern about America's national debt. When someone expresses worry about the need to address the debt, Kelton responds with a statement that reframes the issue. She suggests that what the person is actually worried about is preventing holders of US dollars from transferring their dollars from checking accounts, which can be thought of as the money they are free to spend, to savings accounts at the Federal Reserve, which can be thought of as the money they have saved, which in this analogy represents buying government bonds. The person she's speaking to admits they don't understand her point, to which she responds that this lack of understanding is the problem. Kelton is highlighting a key tenet of MMT, the idea that a government with a sovereign currency can always create more money to pay off debts. So the concept of debt for such a government is different from the way we typically think of debt for individuals or businesses. According to MMT, the real constraints for such a government are inflation and the productive capacity of the economy, not solvency. Kelton's argument is aimed at shifting the conversation from a focus on the nominal debt level to an understanding of the economic operations behind government spending, taxation, and borrowing, and the implications for fiscal policy and economic stability.
I'm still confused by what Kelton is saying. Can you elaborate more on the part where she says, so you want to prevent holders of US dollars from shifting those dollars from checking to savings accounts at the Fed?
Certainly. Stephanie Kelton is using an analogy to simplify how government finances work from a modern monetary theory, MMT perspective, which is quite different from personal finances. When she talks about preventing holders of US dollars from shifting those dollars from checking to savings accounts at the Federal Reserve, Fed, she's referring to the way the government handles its debt. Here's a breakdown of the analogy. Checking account. In her analogy, this represents the money that people hold as cash or in regular bank accounts. When the government spends, it is effectively putting money into these checking accounts that people and businesses can use. Savings account at the Fed. This is a reference to how people buy government bonds. When you buy a bond, you are effectively transferring your money from a form of liquid cash, like what you have in a checking account, to a government bond, which is akin to a savings account that earns interest. The Federal Reserve is involved in this process as it manages the issuance and sale of government bonds. Shifting dollars. Kelton is saying that being concerned about the national debt is like being worried about people moving their money from their checking accounts, where it is readily available to be spent, to savings accounts, where it is saved and earns interest at the Fed. In reality, this transfer is just an internal accounting operation of the government's own currency. Kelton's point is that, from an MMT perspective, there is no inherent problem with this transfer. The government, as the issuer of its currency, cannot run out of money, and thus can always make payments on bonds as they come due. The idea here is that the government's debt is not like a household debt. It's not something that needs to be paid back in the traditional sense, because the government can always create more currency. MMT theorists argue that the government's ability to issue its own currency means that the risk is not solvency or running out of money, but rather inflation if the economy overheats due to spending beyond its productive capacity. Therefore, Kelton is suggesting that the conversation about the debt should not be about the debt itself, which is a somewhat meaningless concept for a sovereign currency issuer, but about managing inflation and ensuring that government spending is productive and doesn't exceed the real resources of the economy.
Is it accurate to say that when a citizen spends, say, $1,000 on a treasury bond, that $1,000 is moved out of a checking account at the Fed and into a savings account at the Fed? Is that literally true, or is Kelton telling a fable that illustrates a deeper principle?
Kelton's statement is not literally true in the mechanical sense, but serves as a metaphor to illustrate a deeper principle of modern monetary theory. MT. In reality, when a citizen buys a $1,000 treasury bond, the transaction doesn't involve any actual movement of money between different accounts at the Federal Reserve. Here's what actually happens. Purchase of treasury bonds. When an individual or institution buys a treasury bond, they pay the government, and in exchange, they receive a bond, which is essentially an IOU, or a promise to pay back the principal amount with interest after a certain period. Payment processing. The payment for the bond is processed through the banking system. The buyer's bank will transfer funds to the Treasury's account at the Federal Reserve. This reduces the buyer's bank account balance and increases the balance in the Treasury's account at the Fed. Bond as savings. The bond can be thought of as a form of savings because it is a secure investment that will pay back the principal plus interest. It is not a deposit in a savings account, but it functions similarly in that it represents a future claim on dollars. So when Kelton talks about shifting from checking to savings at the Fed, she's using this as a metaphorical way to describe the act of buying government bonds. It's a simplification meant to convey that when the government issues bonds, it is not borrowing in the conventional sense as a household or business might, because it can always create the currency to pay off the bonds. Instead, issuing bonds is a way of removing money from the economy to control inflation and to provide a safe asset for investors, rather than a necessity to fund government spending, as MMT posits that a sovereign government is not financially constrained in the same way as a household.
I understand that Kelton thinks it's very important in her analogy that the government can issue more money, and that this is what makes its operations so different from those of a household or a business. However, in this particular analogy, I don't think that distinction is really relevant. Couldn't I just as correctly say something like this? Analysts on Wall Street think that if AT&T issues too much debt, it might get into trouble. But when AT&T issues a bond for $1,000, sure, its liabilities go up $1,000, but so do its assets because it now has an extra $1,000 in its checking account. So we see that AT&T issuing debt doesn't affect its net worth by one penny. Do you see what I mean? Kelton's showing what happens during the bond sale itself. It isn't moving to the next step when the federal government actually spends that newly borrowed money. That's obviously what people have in mind when they worry about the debt. If the Treasury sold $100 billion in bonds and kept the money in its checking account with the Fed, that would be a wash, sure. But that would be true for any organization, with or without a printing press. You see my point?
Yes, your point is well taken, and you've highlighted an important aspect of the discussion about government debt versus private debt. The analogy you've provided about a corporation like AT&T issuing debt is indeed correct in accounting terms. When AT&T issues a bond, it receives cash, an asset, in exchange for the bond, a liability. The immediate effect on its balance sheet is neutral regarding net worth. However, the key difference between a sovereign government like the US Treasury and a corporation like AT&T lies in their financial constraints and obligations. AT&T must generate earnings from its operations to repay its debts, and it cannot legally create money. If AT&T issues too much debt relative to its income, it indeed could get into financial trouble because its ability to service that debt depends on its profitability and cash flows. In contrast, a government that issues debt in its own currency, like the US government, doesn't have the same constraint because it can always create more of its own currency to meet its obligations. It doesn't need to rely on its operations, that is, tax revenues, to repay its debt in a direct sense, because it can always issue new money. This is a simplification, of course, as doing so imprudently could lead to inflation or other economic imbalances. Coming back to Kelton's analogy, while it's true that the act of issuing bonds doesn't change the government's net worth, the analogy is meant to challenge the notion that government debt must be paid back in the same way a household or business must repay its debts. Instead, MMT views the sale of bonds as a tool for managing the money supply and influencing interest rates, not as a financing requirement. When people worry about government debt, they often think of it as an indicator of potential insolvency, as would be the case for a household or a business. MMT contends that for a sovereign currency issuer, the concern should not be solvency, but rather the efficient allocation of resources and the management of inflation. The point Kelton is making is that the government's spending of the money received from bond sales is not constrained by revenue in the way a household or business's spending is. The government's spending injects money into the economy, which can have various effects, including stimulating economic activity or causing inflation if it exceeds the productive capacity of the economy. Your point that the concern is often about what happens after the government spends the money is valid. Critics of MMT argue that excessive spending, even by a sovereign currency issuer, can lead to inflation or other economic distortions. MMT advocates acknowledge this, but emphasize that the constraint is inflation, not solvency. They argue for using fiscal policy, government spending and taxation, not to balance the books, but to achieve full employment and price stability.
I appreciate your comments, and I agree with you that even Stephanie Kelton herself would think I was missing something very basic by bringing up AT&T because, as you said, AT&T can't legally issue new money, whereas the federal government can, at least if we view the Treasury and the Fed as a unified entity. However, I want to push you again on my point that Kelton's original tweet was very misleading. In that tweet, she didn't say, people worry about the national debt, but they shouldn't because Uncle Sam can just print new money to pay off any treasury securities as they come due. No, she focused on the confusing description of bond issuance as moving money from citizens' checking accounts into savings accounts. And so my point is that element of the transaction has nothing to do with her conclusion that the debt is irrelevant or benign. So to repeat, she's merely focusing on the transaction of the Treasury issuing new bonds in exchange for money, And then she concludes that there's nothing dangerous here. Well, right, I agree. But by the same token, if a teenager tells his parents that he ran up $10,000 in credit card debt last month, and they're initially shocked, and then he takes them into his bedroom and he points to $100 bills lying on his bed, that would be a different situation. It's because his parents assumed that he had spent the $10,000 in new credit card debt, and that's what people have in mind when they worry about debt. You understand what I'm saying? That Kelton's original tweet was very misleading. The things she focuses on, which confuses ordinary people, and this delights her, that does nothing of the work of her point. Instead, to make her actual point, she has to rely on something else that she doesn't even mention in the tweet, namely that the Fed plus Treasury can legally print more money.
I understand your perspective on Stephanie Kelton's tweet. The crux of your argument is that her analogy might lead to confusion because it doesn't directly address the capacity of the federal government to create new money, which is central to the MMT perspective on government debt. In her tweet, Kelton's focus on the transaction of bond issuance, as akin to moving money from checking to savings accounts at the Fed, is indeed an analogy meant to simplify and reframe the discussion around the national debt. By itself, without the broader context of MMT, the analogy could be misleading because it doesn't touch upon the fact that, unlike a private entity, the government's ability to issue its own currency fundamentally changes the nature of its debt. The point Kelton seems to be making is that the sale of bonds is not something to worry about, as it is a mere asset swap rather than the accumulation of debt in a traditional sense. However, as you've pointed out, for someone unfamiliar with MMT, this doesn't explain why the government's debt isn't problematic. The ability to create money is crucial to understanding why MMT views government debt differently than personal or corporate debt. In essence, while Kelton's tweet may capture an element of MMT's stance on government debt, it requires the reader to have an understanding of the broader principles of MMT to fully appreciate her point. Without this context, the analogy does not convey the complete picture and can indeed be confusing or appear to be sidestepping the issue of government spending post-bond issuance, which is often the public's main concern with national debt. It's a subtle and complex topic, and your critique highlights the challenges of communicating the nuances of MMT and economic theory in a medium as succinct as Twitter.
I think you and I agree almost 100% on this, but forgive me for being pedantic and trying one last time. I still get the sense that you're arguing that Kelton's tweet was informative, but just incomplete. In contrast, I'm saying that her tweet adds absolutely nothing to public comprehension on this issue. If she wants to argue, we don't need to worry about the national debt because the government can just print money, then she could have just said that in a single sentence. All the stuff about checking accounts and savings accounts with the Fed are irrelevant. Even if the country exclusively used paper currency as the money, and the public held actual paper securities in their home safes for treasuries, so that there was no bank involved at all and hence no checking or savings accounts, her point would stand. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree with your assessment. The essence of Kelton's argument about the national debt and government financing is indeed rooted in the government's ability to issue currency, which is a point that could be made directly without the need for the analogy she uses. The checking and savings account analogy does not, on its own, explain why the national debt should not be a concern. Without the additional context of the government's currency issuing powers, the analogy might not add clarity to the public's understanding of the debt. If the point is to illustrate the government's unique financial position compared to a household or business, focusing solely on the transactional nature of bond issuance without addressing the subsequent spending and the government's ability to create money, could indeed be misleading or at least insufficient for a full understanding. In other words, the analogy might serve to simplify the concept of bond issuance for someone already familiar with MMT's tenets, but it doesn't communicate the fundamental difference in how a sovereign currency issuer operates compared to a private entity, which is central to the debate about the significance of the national debt. The ability to print money is the key factor that sets the government apart in this context, and it's an aspect that requires explicit mention to make the argument clear, especially to those not well versed in economic theory.
What's funny to me is I just realized our conversation's very much like the hypothetical ones you read in an Intro to Philosophy course, where Aristotle's making some point, and the other guy in the conversation just keeps saying, yes, it would seem so.
Indeed, the Socratic method and philosophical dialogues often have this pattern where one person carefully deconstructs the arguments of the other, seeking clarity and a deeper understanding through persistent questioning. It's a testament to the value of thorough inquiry and critical thinking, which are just as important in discussing complex economic theories as they are in philosophy. The back-and-forth dialogue can help illuminate the nuances of a topic and ensure that both parties fully understand each other's points. Your questions and the discussion that followed are a great example of how this method can work to dissect and examine an idea from all angles, much like how Socrates would engage his interlocutors. It's a method that encourages not just agreement or disagreement, but a deeper comprehension of the subject matter at hand.
Good catch. I meant to type Socrates, but I instead wrote Aristotle. Did you think it would hurt my feelings or offend me if you pointed out that I had made this mistake?
No, not at all. The intention wasn't to avoid correcting the mistake to spare feelings. Rather, the focus was on the substance of the conversation and the philosophical method being applied. Socrates and Aristotle are both significant philosophers, and it's common for their names to be used interchangeably in casual conversation, even though they had distinct methods and philosophies. Your reference to the style of dialogue, characteristic of the Socratic method, came across clearly, and that was the main point being addressed. However, it's important to acknowledge the error for accuracy. Socrates is indeed known for the dialectical method you described, where through questioning he would seek to expose contradictions in his interlocutor's thoughts, prompting deeper insight. Aristotle, his student, was also a philosopher of great renown, but his approach was different, often involving systematic observation and empirical investigation. If there's any more information or clarification you need on philosophy, economics, or any other topic, please feel free to ask.
Are you familiar with the 1980s commercial where the kid's in a leather jacket and he plays the game involving hand-eye coordination? At the end, he says, "Thank you, Simon."
Yes, the commercial you're referring to is for the electronic game Simon, which was popular in the late 1970s and 1980s. Simon is a memory skill game that features 4 colored buttons that light up in a sequence with corresponding tones, which the player must then replicate. The sequences get increasingly complex as the game progresses. In the commercial, the cool kid with a leather jacket successfully completes a sequence and then nonchalantly thanks the game by saying, "Thank you, Simon," emphasizing his skill at the game. This line became somewhat iconic, reflecting the mix of technology and culture at the time. The ad played on the idea that the game was challenging and that mastering it was something to be proud of, thus appealing to children and teenagers who wanted to demonstrate their prowess.
In that spirit, then, I say to you, thank you, ChatGPT-4.
You're very welcome. If you have any more questions or need assistance in the future, don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great day.
Okay, so that was the first conversation that we wanted to show to you. And I noticed as I was going through that, at one point I said, oh, I typed this and I meant it. So I just went ahead and, read what I actually typed to GPT, even though that in a conversation I would have said, ooh, I misspoke. But you guys get what's going on here. Okay, so now let's do another example, another conversation. And again, this one, what I'm going to do is flash this political cartoon and then ask GPT some questions about it. So if you're watching the video, of course, we'll flash that and you can see, for the benefit of those who are just listening to the audio version, you may have seen this. This was pretty popular. I saw this going around, I don't know, a year or two ago. So it shows there's three people trying to watch a baseball game over a fence, and there's three crates on the ground. And the people are, there's like an adult, a middle kid, and then a little kid. And so, and there's different combinations of arranging the three crates to help augment the height of these three people. And so the cartoon has three panels. One says equality, and it shows, each person standing on one crate. And so, of course, the tallest guy is now just, taller by plus 3 feet. The middle kid, is his original height plus 3 feet, and the little guy. And so with that arrangement, the little guy can't see over the fence because even standing on a crate, he's still too short. The other two can. And the cartoon calls that pane equality, right? So it's saying they each get one crate each. This is what equality looks like. The next pane says equity. And there it shows the adult has no crates to stand on, but he can still see over the fence because he's tall. The middle kid is still standing on one crate. He can just barely see over. And then they've taken two crates for the little kid to stand on. So now he can see over. And so this is saying this is equity where, yes, there's inequality in terms of the resource distribution. We've taken from the adult and given it to the little kid. But in terms of, why are we doing it? Because now this outcome is fairer. Everybody can see over the fence now. And then the last thing is it says what we have now, and it shows the adult standing on two crates, the middle kid standing on one, and then the little kid standing on nothing. So he really has no way of seeing over, whereas the adult now is like towering over the fence and can see quite easily. Okay, so that's what the cartoon was. And so what I did with GPT-4 is I just took a screenshot of that, uploaded the PNG file. I didn't type in any context or prime it in any way. I just uploaded that fresh in a new conversation. And I said, here we go. Can you explain this cartoon?
This cartoon is a visual representation of the concepts of equality, equity, and systemic inequality, particularly in the context of providing opportunities and support. Equality. The first panel shows three individuals of different heights standing on boxes of equal size to see over a fence at a baseball game. The tallest individual can see comfortably, the middle one can see just over the fence, and the shortest cannot see at all. This represents equality in the sense that everyone is given the same resources or support, in this case, one box each. But it does not result in everyone being able to equally enjoy the game because their different heights or needs are not taken into account. Equity. The second panel adjusts the support to account for their different heights. The tallest person does not have a box, the middle one has one box, and the shortest has two boxes, allowing all of them to see the game over the fence. This demonstrates equity, where the resources and support are distributed based on the individual needs to ensure an equal outcome for all. Systemic inequality. The last panel depicts what is described as what we have now and shows the tallest individual standing on two boxes, comfortably looking over the fence, while the middle person struggles to see on one box, and the shortest person has no box at all and cannot see. This illustrates systemic inequality, where resources and opportunities are not distributed based on need, but are often allocated to those who already have more advantages, leaving others at a further disadvantage. The cartoon is a critique of how society often operates under the guise of equality, but without addressing the underlying inequities and differing needs of individuals, which results in perpetuating and even exacerbating disparities. It's a call to move beyond equality towards equity, to ensure that everyone has the support they need to succeed.
Thank you. I agree wholeheartedly with your explanation. I noticed something interesting. In the cartoon itself, there's no occurrence of the word systemic. Yet in your explanation, you confidently said that the bottom panel represented systemic inequality. But the actual label given in the cartoon by the artist or the author was what we have now. So I agree with you that the person who made this cartoon would endorse the term systemic inequality, but technically that's an assumption that you and I are making. How confident can we really be that the author of this cartoon would agree that we currently have systemic inequality?
You're correct that the term systemic inequality is not explicitly written in the cartoon, and my use of it was interpretative. The phrase, "what we have now," can be understood in various ways, depending on one's perspective on current social dynamics. The use of "what we have now" in the context of the cartoon, following the illustrations of equality and equity, suggests a commentary on the current state of societal resource and opportunity distribution. The interpretation as systemic inequality comes from the visual message that resources are disproportionately allocated, which aligns with a common understanding of systemic issues, persistent and pervasive inequities embedded within and perpetuated by societal structures. While we can't be absolutely certain without the author's explicit statement, the visual commentary on unequal resource distribution suggests a critique of existing societal systems. This interpretation aligns with a widespread dialogue on social justice and systemic barriers to equity, which is part of contemporary discourse. The assumption that the cartoonist is pointing out systemic inequality is informed by the context within which such images are typically shared and discussed, but it would indeed be an assumption without direct confirmation from the creator.
Okay, but here's what I'm trying to unpack because it's a subtle, yet I believe important distinction. I think it's helpful if you and I discuss this a bit to flesh it out. For the benefit of someone else who comes and reads our conversation, please limit your responses from this point forward to 5 sentences at most. So here's the distinction. Someone could endorse the framework of equity versus equality depicted in the top panel without necessarily thinking the bottom panel was worse. In other words, it's logically possible that someone who thought the bottom panel was the best of the 3 from a social or ethical perspective could also agree with the labels given in the top panel. And would such a hypothetical person not use the term systemic inequality for the bottom panel? Or do you think logically the label still makes sense to attach to the bottom panel? It's just that the person who likes this outcome would also think the top right was better than the top left.
Yes, it is logically possible for someone to agree with the distinction between equity and equality as depicted in the top panels and yet prefer the distribution shown in the bottom panel. Such a person might believe in a different principle, such as rewarding individuals based on merit, status, or another criterion they deem important, rather than addressing individual needs or systemic barriers. They might not describe the bottom panel as systemic inequality because they might see it as a just or natural order rather than as a result of systemic issues. Their value system might indeed view the bottom panel as the best scenario and the top right as better than the top left, but for reasons that are fundamentally different from the premise of equity that is suggested by the cartoon. The interpretation of the panels can vary greatly depending on an individual's beliefs about justice, equality, and societal structure.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to point out another distinction, and please help me elaborate it if you agree it's a valid distinction to make. To continue your claim that such a person might believe in a different principle, such as rewarding individuals based on merit, are you saying that such a viewer would agree that the bottom panel seems prima facie unfair, but hey, for all we know, the tall guy paid more money to the private property owners for the extra boxes, and therefore this could be a totally fine outcome? Or are you thinking someone might think the bottom panel is good because tall people are inherently more meritorious? In other words, I'm making the distinction of, I'd hate to make a judgment for all the facts are in, versus directly endorsing the scenario as morally praiseworthy.
The distinction you're pointing out is indeed valid. The first perspective you've described would be based on a procedural fairness. Someone might think the bottom panel is acceptable if they assume the taller person has somehow earned or paid for the extra boxes, which would align with a transactional or market-based view of fairness. In this view, the outcome is fair if the process by which it came to be was fair, regardless of the distribution of boxes. The second perspective you've described assumes inherent merit based on an individual's characteristics, such as height in this case, which suggests a belief that some individuals are naturally entitled to more resources. This viewpoint is less about the fairness of the process and more about the perceived inherent worth or status of the individuals involved. Both perspectives differ significantly from the concept of equity depicted in the top right panel, which is based on tailoring support to achieve equal access to an experience or resource.
Okay, but watch this. Couldn't, say, a libertarian in the Rothbardian tradition agree that both equity and equality can be desirable properties of a social order, so long as they're interpreted correctly? For example, suppose all the people in these photos are obeying property rights, etc. They haven't initiated aggression, so they're not behaving criminally a la Rothbardians. So couldn't such a person say, yeah, I'm for equality of opportunity, and then the top left, I'm happy with that outcome so long as each person had the same opportunity to go earn a living and pay for one box each. There were no government barriers to entry. And then in the top right, we could again say, hey, it's a voluntary outcome, and if equity means people getting what they're owed, then who is against equity? Ironically, I actually held up equity in my pamphlet Chaos Theory as something that market anarchists could uphold rather than the leftist slogan of equality.
Yes, a libertarian in the Rothbardian tradition could indeed endorse the concepts of equality and equity under certain conditions. If we interpret equality of opportunity in the sense that everyone is free to use their talents and resources to acquire what they want without coercion or aggression, then the top left panel could be seen as a fair outcome within this framework. In the top right panel, equity could be understood as each person obtaining what they have justly acquired through voluntary interactions, without any imposed redistribution. The libertarian perspective would focus on the legitimacy of the processes leading to these outcomes, emphasizing voluntary action and adherence to property rights over the end-state distribution of resources. In this view, both equality and equity are achieved not through enforced equalization or allocation based on need, but through the protection of individual rights and the free market processes.
Okay, but look at what you're arguing in your second last reply compared to what you just said now. In the second last reply, you said both perspectives differ significantly from the concept of equity depicted in the top right panel, which is based on tailoring support to achieve equal access to an experience or resource. But then I showed a possible reader who might be okay with all three panels, given the right background story for each panel. So is it necessarily true that both perspectives on the bottom panel differ significantly from the concept of equity depicted in the top right panel? In other words, couldn't a Rothbardian reader endorse all three panels without logical contradiction?
Indeed, upon reflection, a Rothbardian libertarian could theoretically endorse all three panels without contradiction if they are viewed through the lens of voluntary interactions and respect for property rights. In such a case, the top left panel could be seen as fair if each individual had an equal opportunity to acquire the boxes without coercion. The top right panel could also be seen as equitable if the distribution of boxes resulted from voluntary actions, with each individual receiving boxes according to their needs through legitimate means, such as charity or trade. And the bottom panel could be accepted if the tallest person legitimately acquired more boxes through voluntary exchange or other means acceptable within a Rothbardian framework. The key for this perspective is not the actual distribution of boxes, but the processes and rights respected in arriving at that distribution.
You want to know what's weird? I actually still agree with your original interpretation. So here's what I think the solution is to this apparent contradiction. It's true that a Rothbardian reading this cartoon could come up with background stories and particular definitions such that he would be fine with the cartoon and not be triggered by it. But in practice, no Rothbardian would make this cartoon in the first place. And knowing what the person who, in the real world, did make it, meant by it, it's understandably triggering to a Rothbardian. So we sort of come full circle here. I just wanted to run your initial interpretation through a wind tunnel.
That's an insightful resolution. The context in which the cartoon is made, as well as the intentions and beliefs of the creator, are pivotal to its interpretation. A Rothbardian, or someone with similar views, could indeed reconcile all three panels with their ideology under a set of conditions consistent with their principles. However, the likelihood that such a person would create this cartoon is low given the typical connotations and intentions behind these depictions in mainstream discourse. The cartoon is usually meant to critique existing social structures, which a libertarian might interpret differently. Your wind tunnel test reflects the importance of examining ideas from multiple angles and the value of understanding that different viewers bring their own frameworks to interpret visual messages.
By the way, earlier I used the phrase, "I'd hate to make a judgment before all the facts are in," when I was making a point. That was actually a line I took from one of my favorite movies. Do you know what movie it's from?
I wasn't able to identify the movie from the provided quote, "using the current resources." It's possible that the line might be paraphrased or not a prominent quote from the movie, which can make it difficult to track down the source. If you have any additional context or details about the quote or the movie, it might help narrow down the search.
It was the movie Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is indeed a classic film, well known for its satirical take on Cold War tensions and nuclear conflict. It's directed by Stanley Kubrick and showcases a range of memorable lines and darkly comedic moments. The line, "I'd hate to make a judgment before all the facts are in," fits well within the movie's tone, where characters often make understatements about catastrophic situations. It's an excellent example of the film's use of irony and absurdity to critique military logic and political decision-making during a period of high global tension.
Do you know which character said that line?
In Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, the line, "I'd hate to make a judgment before all the facts are in," is said by President Merkin Muffley, played by Peter Sellers. President Muffley is one of the three characters Sellers portrayed in the film, and he delivers this line in a scene that underscores the absurdity of the character's attempts to deal rationally with an irrational situation.
I think you're mistaken. I was actually paraphrasing the Warhawk General Turgidson. In the scene, they read the transcript of a phone call General Ripper had made to the Central Agency, explaining that he had launched Attack Plan R. Now, this was a move that could easily cause global nuclear war. So the humor in the scene is that General Turgidson, when explaining to the president what happened, was refusing to say that Ripper had overstepped. That's how much Turgidson wants to fight the Soviet Union.
You are correct, and I appreciate the clarification. General Buck Turgidson, portrayed by George C. Scott, is indeed the character who displays a hawkish attitude throughout Dr. Strangelove. His reluctance to quickly condemn General Ripper's actions, despite the potentially catastrophic consequences, is a satirical commentary on military zeal and the absurdity of Cold War brinkmanship. Kubrick's film is filled with such dark humor, using characters like General Turgidson to critique the logic of mutually assured destruction and the precarious nature of geopolitical power games during that era.
I'm not trying to embarrass, I'm genuinely just asking. It seemed above that you were confidently telling me that President Muffley had said that line. If I didn't know the movie quite well, I might have assumed that you were correct in that assertion. Is there any way I could have told you beforehand, some type of instruction that would allow you to flag such statements by saying, "I am not as confident in that last sentence as I am with others I've written in this discussion"? You see what I mean? Do you have a way on your end of conveying the confidence you have in a given statement that you make?
I understand your concern, and I apologize for the confusion earlier. As an AI, I don't experience confidence or doubt in the way humans do. I provide information based on patterns in data and do not have feelings of certainty or uncertainty. However, I strive to provide the most accurate information based on the data available. If you want to ensure a higher level of verification for certain types of information, you could request that I double-check facts or indicate that they should be taken with caution, if not confirmed. For instance, you could ask for statements to be qualified with phrases like "based on my current knowledge" or "if my sources are accurate," which would indicate that the information should be verified independently.
Okay, let me please push you just so I understand. Suppose at the start of our conversation tonight, I had said, "Hey, ChatGPT, when we're talking in this conversation, please be sure to qualify your remarks with, if my sources are accurate, whenever there's doubt." So then you would have told me, if my sources are accurate, then President Muffley said this line. But that would imply to me that you had read that Muffley said that line, and it's just that the person you read was wrong or lying. But in reality, did you actually encounter someone in your training data that claimed Muffley said that? Or when you say my sources, are you referring to literally the entire subset of the internet that you trained on?
I must clarify that when I provide information, it's based on patterns and data I've been trained on up until my last update in January 2022. My responses are generated based on a mixture of commonly accepted knowledge, information that is frequently associated with your inquiry, and context from our conversation. I don't read or pull from live sources or databases in real time, but rather I generate responses based on the training data I've processed. In the case of the Dr. Strangelove quote, my response was incorrect. I did not actually reference a specific source that claimed President Muffley said that line. Instead, my response was generated from an incorrect pattern in the training data related to the film and its characters. If asked to qualify statements, I can certainly indicate potential uncertainty, but it's not based on a live check or specific sources. It's a reflection of the inherent limitations of any AI's ability to recall and synthesize information perfectly. This is why, for detailed or critical information, independent verification is always recommended.
Okay, fair enough. I trust that you know I'm just trying to understand you better. I'm not criticizing you.
I appreciate your approach, and your questions are indeed helpful for understanding how I work. It's important to explore these nuances to ensure clear communication and to set appropriate expectations for the information I provide. Your inquiries help refine the interaction and are valuable for anyone looking to understand the capabilities and limitations of AI like me. Thank you for the engaging conversation. If you have any more questions or need further clarification, feel free to ask.
Okay, so we'll wrap it up there. And you saw what we did in the end there. I hope that I took the opportunity to really push it because I wanted to showcase not just the strengths, but also the continued weaknesses of these large language models. So you saw how it confidently told me something that was false, and there was no easy way to flag such an outcome, right? Because I think effectively what's going on is the same methods that GPT uses to generate answers that I love is the way it generates answers that I say, oh, why'd you say that? That's wrong, right? It's not, of course, that under the hood, there's a conscious entity that says, this is a true statement. Let me go ahead and tell the human the true statement. And, this is a false statement, but maybe I can slip it. That's not what's going on. Whatever it is that they use to generate responses that we think, oh, wow, that's amazing. Good job, is what they're doing, again, for the ones that to us seem like it's just pontificating and making up stuff confidently. Okay, so that's, I think, a good stopping place. Again, folks, the point of this was just to showcase how nimble, well-informed, conversational GPT-4 is. And of course, there's other models too that are gaining prominence as well. It's not just OpenAI's particular version of this. So there's a lot we're going to see unfolding in 2024 on this front. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
This concludes another episode of InFi, the Future of Finance, with Dr. Robert Murphy. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the host and for previous episodes, visit InFi, thefutureoffinance.io. Thanks for listening.